I wanted to begin with the thought that being a people is tied to being connected to respected leadership, or at least that respected leadership can provide a kind of point of coalescence around which to identify yourselves as a people. And I think that's often what strong leadership does, even if it's negative, like Hitler or something, right? But a strong leader can provide a focal point, not just for making decisions, but for identifying yourselves even as a people. And so, really, when we look at the full form of the Bible's history, which goes from Genesis through Kings, what we've got is a text that serves a people after kings, right? When there were no more kings. And that is looking back to all of Israel's history, but closing that down with this period of kings, which had represented the complete success of the people at a certain point. And so my goal for the day is to consider how Judah's last great king, as opposed to last great president, to consider how Judah's last great king was remembered as part of keeping identity after the end of Israel and Judah. Okay? So to consider how Judah's last great king was remembered as part of keeping identity after the end of Israel and Judah. The king that I have in mind is going to be the figure Josiah. And he's the one that's in chapters 22 and 23, second book of Kings. Now, we're going to do just a couple of things. I want to talk a little bit about the big picture of this history from Genesis through Kings and its close in the end of 2 Kings. And then what we'll do for the rest of the time is to look through the Josiah story and see what we see in terms of what mattered to them. What was it to the writers of this story that made him the last great king of Judah? So just as I asked you to think about this, and I was hoping that you'd give different categories, everything from hope, in the case of FDR, to, economics, and just good times in the case of also sort of FDR and Clinton, perhaps, changing society, war and peace, being a joke. Well, that doesn't qualify so well. But still, we'll see what we see when we look at Josiah. I don't think he gets the joke line. He didn't make other people feel like they could be king. Now, when it comes to the narrative of the Bible as a whole, if I said, imagine that you just lost your land, your independence, and your whole identity was threatened. Imagine the end of the United States, at least for one, whatever other identities you may have. And whatever you may think of presidents, and whatever you may think of the United States, who we are and how we live is tied up with this political identity even. But if there will be no more presidents, and there will be no more American politics, then what do? I mean, in a country like this, maybe there's a lot of people who would just give up American identity. It's an immigrant country in a lot of ways anyway, or immigrant country. So, one response would be to either to go back home, wherever that was, and people in your family's past, or to simply accept the new regimes, whatever they are, and however they divide if China takes over, the United States, 50 years from now, and we become the People's Republic of People's Republic of America underneath the great umbrella of China, then you could say, all right, we're all Chinese now, and and that's just the way it is. I don't know, right? I mean, but it's also possible to try to hang on to an identity from your past. And the Jewish people managed to do this in a striking way for centuries. And the roots of that lie in the formation of the Bible, and even in the telling of this story of the Israel that we've been studying for this course. So really, this is what the books of Genesis through Kings do as a set. They tell the story of this people, but in order to provide a point of reference for keeping identity as the people of Judah, and beyond that, the people of Israel. So keeping this in mind, I wanted to look at the last part of the book of Kings. So this is chapter 25. So I have, just while this is coming down then, so the way I had you look at 4 chapters, that 22, 23, 24, and 25. These are the last 4 chapters of the books of Kings, the last chapters of this whole history. Josiah is in 22 and 23. 24 and 25 tell the end. And the kings are awful. Like none of there are, like, I don't know, 4 kings, I think, after Josiah, something like that. And they're all portrayed as awful. A couple of them rule longer. A couple of them don't last very long at all. None of them represent any kind of success. In the end, what we're going to find is that the last bright light, you might say, the last positive thing to remember about the people's leadership is embodied in the character of Josiah. And so that's where we're going to go after we look at this. But before we go to looking at Josiah, I wanted just to look at the very end. So this is going to be on down even. Yeah. So, we've been, whatever. I mean, all this, you say the height of one pillar was 18 cubits, and on it was a bronze capital. And you think, what are they talking about? Why are they talking about this? And it's just because they've destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem as a whole has been destroyed. They've carried off the loot, and so they're going into a little bit of detail. So they carry off various people. In fact, well, we'll start at 18. The captain of the guard took the chief priest, the second priest, and 3 guardians. From the city, he took an officer who had been in command of the soldiers, 5 men of the king's council, the secretary, 60 men of the land. All these people are taken. And I guess it's describing them because they're leadership, right? And then it says Nebuzaradan, anglicize it, the captain of the guard took them and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. The king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. So this is in Syria, way up north of Israel, but still far from Babylon itself. Evidently, the king of Babylon is leading his army on campaign. So Judah went into exile out of its land. He appointed Gedaliah, son of Ahikam, son of Shaphan, as governor over the people who remained in the land of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had left. So then it gives you all these captains. He's saying, don't worry about the Babylonians. But then when you get down to the very end here, it says, in the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, King Evil-Merodach of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, released King Jehoiakim of Judah from prison. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the other seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes. Every day of his life he dined regularly in the king's presence. For his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, a portion every day, as long as he lived. The end. It's a little bit funny way to end the entire history of the people of Israel and Judah. And so before we went to looking at Josiah, I wanted you to help me figure out, what are we learning by ending the entire story this way? Why do this? Okay, so especially the very end, right? So I ran through a little bit of this for context, right? They're defeated, a bunch of their leaders are killed, the rest, a bunch more. I mean, it says, so Judah went into exile out of its land. But then they have a governor over the people who are left, so there's a split. In fact, probably most of the people stayed. just the wealthier and more powerful, more important people were hauled away. But after you know that, the camera zooms in on the president, or the king. This guy Jehoiakim, who turns out actually not even to be the last king of Judah. He's the second to last king of Judah. At some point, I think I told you that the way the kings in the line of David work was that they were supposed to go father to son. And so this guy's father was a guy named Jehoiakim. And so Jehoiakim becomes king, and he only lasts 3 months before he's taken away in an earlier defeat from the Babylonians, the first defeat in 598, if you read the chapter. So he hardly rules, but off he goes to Babylon unharmed. While then this guy named Zedekiah becomes the last king of Judah. And he reigns for 10 years before then he rebels, and they have to put down that rebellion. And that's when they destroy the city and the temple and everything. Interesting fact, though, is that Zedekiah is Jehoiakim's uncle, if you think of it that way. He's the brother of the former king. So in the tradition, he shouldn't be king. He's out of the line. And it's only because the Babylonians kind of put him there that he got to be king at all. They figured it was okay to be a brother. It wasn't part of Judah's tradition. So meanwhile, this guy who hasn't been king for 10 years is sitting there eating well at the table of the king of Babylon, and that's what we want to know. That's the last thing you'd want to know, isn't it? It's a nice, and they live happily ever after kind of ending, sort of. So help me, so why does the story end this way? Why does it end this way? Is it a happy ending? Is it a tragedy? How are you supposed to take it? Are you supposed to feel good when you read this? Feel sorry for the poor guy? Yeah, go ahead.
This is just a guess, but maybe it's meant to convey that through fortune and misfortune, the Jews are still God's chosen people.
Okay, I like your line of thought. So the idea would be that somehow, through good and bad, the Jews are still God's chosen people, to use your phrase. So how would that be the case? Like, how would that ending communicate that the Jews are still chosen, or the people of Judah, you could say, are still chosen? And when you say God's chosen people, then, of course, that God hasn't abandoned them would be another. Yeah, go ahead.
He's been spared, sort of, for lack of a better word.
Okay.
He's out of prison, even though he's in captivity, he's respected, or he's not in prison anymore, even though he might not be
Okay.
completely on their own. He's still, a portion every day is sort of like that.
What do you think it means that he's at the king's table? Anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
See, I kind of took the whole king's table thing as kind of like a negative, sad ending.
Okay.
That repetition really says for his allowance, regular allowance given by the king, a portion every day, as long as he worked. It kind of sounded like there was just this really obvious dominance over.
Yeah, he's dependent.
So subordinate, and
Yeah.
he was going to live that way as long as he lived.
Yeah.
So I kind of took it as it was just in kind of a cooler, passive-aggressive way.
Yeah. It's sort of funny, your two reactions, because I like having them both on the table, because I think we got to hear them both, in a sense. That on one hand, the subordination of even the king of Judah is absolutely part of this picture. It's a good thing to observe. At the same time as the fact that there he is, he's not imprisoned, he's not been killed or maimed, which happened to one of the others. He's provided for, even respected, because to be at the king's table is something that would be true for an important guest. It's not like just anybody gets that. So yeah, there's a little of both of those. Any other reactions to this? Well, so at least I want you to notice the following. Number one, in case it was not clear, if you're just trying to think, when was this written? Like, or even when were the books of Kings written? And unless you imagine a kind of diary style of writing biblical books, where you say, all right, well, we got to the end of, Joash, and then we got to the end of Athaliah, good to get rid of her, we'll add a little note, add a little note. But of course, even the editorial framework makes clear that somebody's organizing this with the bigger picture in mind. So even just the books of Kings take you from Solomon to this end time, and that's, 350 years? So this book, in its final form at least, has to cover 350 years of history, never mind everything that came before that in the history of Israel that's presented in Genesis through Kings. And so if you're trying to figure out, for all this time, the professor keeps talking about dates of authorship, and he keeps saying that the key time of writing is under the monarchy, and or at least even the key time of starting writing is under the monarchy, but maybe it's finished afterward. Why would he be saying these things? Well, maybe you have to argue it piece by piece. But for the books of Kings, and in some sense for the history as a whole, part of that argument is this passage, because it gives us a date. It gives us a date that's close to the end of the kingdom of Judah, in that you could say, I don't know, it's somebody who is acting at least as if he knows that the king of Judah is still alive and well in Babylon, and acting as if that matters, that you would want to know it. But also it makes clear that the end of the story of Israel and Judah, as told in this sequence from Genesis through Kings, is the end of Judah as a kingdom. That at that point, in the mind of whoever's putting this together, that's the end of the story. So it is written after the demise, or finished at least, after the demise of Judah, for an audience after that demise. And that's why I said that, looking backward, who's the last great king? But the perspective is after the end of all of this, in order to establish some sense of identity and in some sense of value, perhaps. It's interesting that it doesn't mention God directly, so that there's not actually a focus on God per se, but there is at least a sense of survival. It's interesting that the Persians and Cyrus are not mentioned. There's a parallel version to all of this story, at least about kings, in the books of Chronicles. And that story, even though it mostly is occupied with the same thing, it also ends with the same general destruction. But the closing lines of the books of Chronicles mention Cyrus, the king of the Persians, who is said to allow the first set of people of Judah back to their land. And that gives you a different perspective. It's a hope in a different kind of way. And also sort of pushes you a little later into a perspective dominated by the Persians and their empire, whereas the books of Kings have no sense that the Persians are coming. And so a lot of scholars have figured that it was written during this first generation or two after the end, before the Persians. So in terms of dates, 586 is when Jerusalem was destroyed. 538 is about when the Persians take over from Babylon. So we're talking, 60 years? 50 years. But then I think it is important for all the negative that you see this king still alive. And the reason is not so much for hope that he could become king again, but remember this House of David tradition that a king from the House of David always has to be on the throne over Judah, and ideally over Israel before it, as at least the whole Bible puts the story together, and that it's supposed to go father to son. That's how the succession goes. In the book of Chronicles, there's even a chapter that takes you about 12 generations down the line of David past the last king of Judah, so that you have a sense that whether it's a record or somebody's imagination, there's a sense that the line continues. And at the end of the book of Kings, there's the hope of another king from the line of David, because there he is. He's alive, he's eating well, and potentially capable of procreating. They don't go into that part. So, which is the most important thing for a king to do at a certain level. So, this is the end of Kings. Now, with the last 20 minutes that I've got, I want to look at Josiah. And, my question really is, what is so great about Josiah? What is so great about Josiah? And there's no question that the biblical text treats him as great. So it starts at the beginning. Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. The dates for that are usually treated as 639 to 609. 639 to 609. So he dies, what is that then, right? 20-some years before the end, but really only about 10 years before Babylon takes over, which is 598. So 639 to 609. His mother's name was whatever. He did what was right. Sorry, if we get into all these names. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in all the way of his father, David. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left. Right? So he's definitely going to get the seal of approval from this writer. In the 18th year of King Josiah, this is verse 3, the king sent so-and-so, son of so-and-so, right, to the house of the Lord, sends him to the temple, saying, go to the high priest Hilkiah and have him count the entire sum of money that has been brought into the house of the Lord. So they take all the income from gifts to the temple, and Josiah says that he wants to initiate repairs to the temple, sort of upgrade the temple. And so the next few verses, all the way down to verse 7, has to do with setting this up, right? Carpenters, builders, masons, buy timber, stone to repair the house, right? No accounting shall be asked from them for the money that is delivered into their hand, for they deal honestly, right? Which is important. Actually, trust the temple officials, they'll do it. Then verse 8, so this high priest says, okay, apparently they've been doing it. So that's the first part, renovations. Second part, this guy, high priest, says, I found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And this term law is the term Torah, which is the first part of the Bible as we talked about it. So he's saying, I found this in particular, book of the law, in the house of the Lord. So when Hilkiah, that's the name of this high priest, gave the book to this scribe, that's what the secretary is, a scribe, he read it, and so then he reports to the king that they found this. The priest Hilkiah has given me a book. So the scribe then reads it aloud to the king. Talk about, again, scribal culture, right? How this works. The king can't read, of course, so I got to have somebody read it for him. So what happens, right? The very first thing, when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. I think I asked you this question before, what that is, right? It's mourning, it's grief, it's repentance. So then the king commands, this is verse 12, the high priest and all these people, go inquire of Yahweh, the Lord, for me, for the people, for all Judah, concerning the words of this book that has been found, for great is the wrath of the Lord, because our ancestors did not obey the words of this book to do according to all that is written concerning us. This is kind of funny. He's really ready to blame the ancestors, but he doesn't say anything about himself or his own people. So when he says, go inquire of the Lord, what do? The priest, again, Hilkiah, and all these people, including the scribe and these other leaders, they go to a woman. Isn't that great? If you want to talk to God, find a female prophet. This really struck me. There's only, among people who are interested in women's roles in the Bible, it's natural that prophetesses would be a popular topic. And there aren't very many, so they tend to get much studied. But, one of the famous ones is this woman, Huldah. And I guess what struck me this time was how not just that she happens to be a prophetess, but that in this situation where Josiah figures that this enormous breach between the people and God has been discovered, we need a prophet. She is the one person you go to, right? She is the head prophet, the best prophet, I don't know. So that's gives her a little more status than I would have realized. So she declares, thus says the Lord, I will indeed bring disaster on this place. It's too late. The end is going to come. But then she says, at least at the end of the chapter, because your heart was penitent and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard how I spoke against this place, because you've torn your clothes and wept before me, I've heard you. Therefore, I will gather you to your ancestors, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace, which is a little bit funny because he gets killed in battle by the king of Egypt. But at least it's peace in the sense that he will not see the disaster. He's not going to see the end of Judah, which seems to be what they have in mind. Okay, so that's the prophet. So what happens next? The king directed that all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem be gathered to him. And so they make a covenant. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of the Lord. And they stand there, and he makes a covenant before the Lord to follow the Lord, keeping his commandments, his decrees, and all that, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book. All the people join in the covenant, right? So that's the next section. Then after this, it says he commands the high priest and so on. And then they start destroying things. They bring out of the temple all the vessels made for Baal. I mean, so the temple apparently has got all this stuff in it that's not really for Yahweh. And the funny thing is that even though Josiah is portrayed as renovating the temple, it never says anything about the renovations getting rid of Baal stuff or Asherah stuff. That only happens when he gets the scroll. So now, at least as the story has it, right? So then off he goes, and he wipes out these images. He breaks down the houses of these male temple prostitutes, or whatever they really are. He brings these priests out and defiles their high places. These are other worship places. Keep on going down. And it really, I mean, we don't have to go through all the details, but the entire section down to verse 20 is all this kind of purification of worship in Judah. So that was verse 4 to 20. And then you have a few more verses. We don't have to go all the way to the end, but the next big thing, at least to notice, is at the end of that, verse 21, he says, the king commanded all the people, keep the Passover of Yahweh your God as prescribed in this book of the covenant. No such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel, or of the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, they did it. Right? So this is another thing that Josiah does. So, all right, so that's as far as we go. From there, it just kind of closes out. The story tells how he died. So what's the best way to do this? So what was so great about Josiah? Help me a little bit, then I'll fill in the gaps. I've got my own list. What was so great about him? How about your own list for presidents? Did he have any impact on the economy? Yeah?
He had a big impact on religion.
He had a big impact on religion. Had a big impact on religion. So what did he do in terms of religion? Well, we'll hold that thought, but go ahead.
In the chapter we read of the other book, it was talking about how they only used like one scale classification, what was pleasing to the Lord, what was displeasing to the
Yeah,
Lord.
yeah.
And what he did was, like, by cleaning up all the idols and the things that were displeasing to the Lord, he's, like it says, he turned to the Lord with all his heart. His commitment to keeping, like, sort of clean of everything that
Yeah.
wasn't pleasing to God was beneficial to all the people.
Okay, so I mean, at least certainly in the religious perspective of the writer of the books of Kings, it's a beneficial thing to have God happy. And in order to do that, he both gets rid of worship of other gods and gets rid of other places of worship that seem to be for Yahweh himself, but that are seen to be not appropriate in some way. That becomes a really interesting question. But effectively, one of the things he does, if you didn't notice, is he actually brings more power to himself in Jerusalem, right? That if he says, all you various religious authorities who work in other places, what you do is illegitimate, we're wiping it out. The only good place where you can worship is Jerusalem and this temple. Then that focuses power in Jerusalem, and at least indirectly on himself. Does he really take over worship? Everything to do with worship of Yahweh? He doesn't, in a way. Do you see what he does that is not taking over everything? Let's back to chapter 22 rather. No, let's go back up. Go back, to pretty much the beginning. And so if you go, that's good, even if we're there. Do you remember what he does? Does he take over all power over religion? He doesn't. What does he do with religion? What does he do? Do you see what I'm after? So for all that he says, if you're not in Jerusalem, you're no good. And any kind of worship that's not done in religion, in Jerusalem, has to go. But what happens in Jerusalem? Yeah? Go ahead.
Doesn't it kind of bring a bad reform of like the whole like Jewish faith, like they find the book and stuff?
Okay, so they find the book, and he brings about this reform, although that's a good question, actually. So the reform involves a couple of things. A lot of it is portrayed as the stuff they got rid of outside of Jerusalem. It does say he cleanses the temple, like he gets this other stuff out of the temple that's not for Yahweh. But why did they find the book? Yeah?
Because he told them to account the amount of money that they had.
Yeah, so, and who does he tell, right? So the thing I want you to see, right, is that all this happens because he actually hands over this whole renovation to the people who run the temple itself. And so on one hand, he's portrayed as wiping out all the sort of religious leadership in the countryside. But the religious leadership in Jerusalem, he treats with great respect, this guy Hilkiah. And he even says, all this money, you don't even have to count it. Like, we're not going to keep accounts, because when it says, well, I know they're honest, but in effect what he's saying is, I'm not going to impinge on your turf, right? This is yours to do. I will show you the respect of letting you run it yourself. So if you're thinking, what was so great about Josiah, then there is this whole package for sure that's focused on religion. But it's interesting because he's pulling power to himself and to Jerusalem, but underneath that, he's treating the temple and its leadership as a real independent entity. So do you notice anything else? Like if you just go with the text, right? So one long section was wiping out all the bad things, right? That was this long section in chapter 23. Another section is renovations to the temple. He's remembered as doing that this was a good thing, that he said, look, let's put some resources into worship of Yahweh at the temple. It deserves it, let's do it. The writer likes that. What else can you tell makes Josiah great? Even in this first part. How do you tell? Yeah, go ahead.
A lot of the other kings, it talks about how they acted like their immediate fathers, but it mentions how he acted like David way in the beginning, which was a lot different
Okay.
than some of the other ones. And even in these last chapters, it talks about the immediately previous kings,
Yep.
not all the way back.
Okay, that's a good comparison. In fact, when I was preparing this, I went through myself just to look at all the kings of Judah. And in fact, there's a whole string that are identified. There's like 4 or 5 in a row, starting with Joash in particular, the one who was, we told the story of Judah's kings from Joash after Athaliah, the queen. So after him, there's like 4 or 5 generations, and they're all said to be good, just like their father. And like you say, this one now compares them all the way back to David. and Hezekiah before him is compared to David. Otherwise, it's a pretty unusual thing. And so, yeah, this is a big sign of approval. This is right at the beginning. They compare him to David. Then there's the business about the repairs of the temple. Let me show you something. Let's go to the do the Deuteronomy one, if you've got it. So one thing you could wonder if you're reading this is a little bit of a sidetrack, I suppose. What on earth made Josiah think that this was a disaster? Right? So you find this piece of writing, and it's associated with the law of Yahweh, or teaching of Yahweh, this Torah. Torah really probably means teaching more than law per se. And then it has this covenant that they talk about. It's the teaching of the covenant, or the book of the covenant. And the first reaction is, when he reads it, we are in big trouble. The end is coming. And then when he goes to the prophet, she says, you're right. The end is coming. You're in big trouble. We'll just put it off until after you die. But whatever the message that he got is, the way we have been behaving, not just God doesn't like it, but he is going to destroy the people. So for somebody like me, at least, who's, I don't know, used to what's in here, there are two passages that immediately came to mind. And it's got to be referring to one or both of these two passages. One of them is in the book of Leviticus, which we're not going to look at. This is Leviticus chapter 26, if you want to read it for fun and profit. But the other one is in the book of Deuteronomy, and it's a little bit more likely that this is the reference. So this is how it goes. This is at the end of the book of the book of Deuteronomy, which is the last of these Torah books. And it gets to this point, God's talking. If you will, this is Moses talking, maybe. If you will only obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commands that I am commanding you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, if you obey the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city. Blessed shall you be in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, the fruit of your livestock, the increase of your cattle. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall you be when you come in. Blessed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will cause your enemies who rise against you to be defeated before you. Right? Just pick your category. You're good, right? Whatever your problems may be, God will be on your side and make sure it comes out. And especially that means a little bit like the presidential issues, right? It's the economy, stupid, right? This is the first thing that you need as a blessing. But then there's also war and peace. You get to win the wars. Everything will work for you. However, if you go down to verse 15, but if you will not obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments and decrees, which I am commanding you today, then all these curses, meaning the following, shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, cursed shall you be in the field, and the basket, and the womb, and so on. But if we go down a little more, they really get into the curses, much more than the blessings. Blessings, fine, they give you the basic, but with curses, I mean, the Lord will cause you to be defeated. This is verse 25. Before your enemies, you shall go out against them one way and flee before them 7 ways. You shall become an object of horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Your corpses shall be food for every bird of the air and animal of the earth, and there shall be no one to frighten them away. The Lord will afflict you with the boils of Egypt, with ulcers, scurvy, and itch. This is meaning probably the plagues that go back to the Moses story, maybe even. The Lord will afflict you with madness and blindness, confusion. You shall grope about at noon, right? They really get into the curses. And there's like 50 verses of curses that occupy the rest of this chapter. So it appears that this is what Josiah is being portrayed, at least, as having read. Whatever exactly. So, and there's a somewhat similar version in Leviticus. So, yeah, this is the covenant that is mentioned for Josiah which is a covenant that the book of Deuteronomy says was made between Israel and the people and God back from the very beginning. Now, in the last few minutes I've got, let me just run through a few observations from my side, things that I want you to notice about what made Josiah great, you could say. So let's start with his leadership in religion. It's almost trite because it seems so obvious in the Bible. They like people who are religious, you could say, or who respect Yahweh and do things that are good for him. But notice how this plays out specifically. First, he's an advocate of the Bible. He's an advocate of the Bible. And when I say that, I don't mean just stuff like what's in the Bible. I mean, he finds a text, he reads it, and he responds to it. A text, a sacred text, that becomes part of the Bible. So in some ways, you could say this, I think, in fact, in the Bible, this is the first story of response to written authority, to sacred written authority, to Scripture, you could even say. We don't know what it is he's reading, but it's got something like this Deuteronomy 28 that's part of it. And he treats it like Scripture, you could say, holy writing. Also, he's an advocate of prophecy, which is not automatic, right? I mean, a king could be uncomfortable with prophecy. Prophets get messages directly from God and don't always say what you like. But he seems to have prophets working for him, or at least working with him. And when he needs a prophet, which he initiates, notice that he wants prophecy. He goes and finds somebody to do it, and the person he goes to is a woman, which, again, I appreciate. He's an advocate of the Jerusalem temple. This is what I said, right? So these are these various aspects of Judah's religion. And he treats its priests with great respect and puts them in charge of what will be the only legitimate shrine in Judah. He declares a new covenant as the basis for a religious bond with Yahweh for all the people as a people. Okay, so that was my fourth of those, right? So he's got these three advocacies: Bible, prophecy, temple. He declares a new covenant, and he confirms that covenant. This is the last one, number 5. He confirms that covenant by celebrating a Passover. And it's interesting. I mean, it's almost shocking how it says, you could almost read from this, Passover was not a holiday before Josiah, right? I mean, it's a good question whether it says, well, it was kind of a holiday, they just didn't do it this way. But then what is this way? Is it a national holiday only with Josiah? People just did it in their families, households? It's an intriguing passage. To kind of close up, a couple more points. Josiah is a strong leader who pushes for a strong monarchy. So if you make the old presidency comparison, people are always talking about the sort of balance between the power of the presidency and the executive branch versus the other branches in the American federal system. And so this kind of balance could have existed in the politics of Judah as well as the politics of Israel and worked its way out in different ways. Josiah is pushing for a stronger executive. So for all that the Bible likes him and considers him great, to think of George Washington again, if you didn't like that, then you would not have liked Josiah. He wanted to be king, and he wanted a strong kingship. So the picture you should come away with is that the whole Genesis to Kings history shares the perspective that religion determines destiny. In Kings, the rulers have ultimate responsibility for the fate of the people. This is a very centralizing idea, that you put that responsibility on the leader and on the king. And so from this perspective, Josiah was a great king because at least in that role, he did the right things that should be embodied in that power, using that political power to support a very particular religious agenda, you could say. And so there you go. That is how we're left with the end of the history of Israel and Judah, according to the Bible's own story of it. And from there, it's going to take us into what happened after, what happened next. So with the rest of the course, we're going to end up looking at a kind of mix of some of that what happened after, and then a few sort of larger themes. Okay? So have a good weekend.